Hey everybody, it's Alex. Before we get in the show, and you're really going to like this one, we've got a special guest you're really going to enjoy. This is not going to be our last show. After Joe and I recorded this episode today, we will be doing an Election Day special, so look for that Tuesday mornings wherever you get your podcasts. Till then, I think you're really going to like this one.
Hey everybody, it's Joe Trippi, and welcome back to That Trippi Show with Alex Hashlow. Over 60 million people have already voted. Now it's time to run through the tape. In places where it's going to be really close, like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, getting out the vote really matters. You can just forget about the polling at this point. Now it's all about who turns out. One of the big questions this cycle, who's been early voting? How will it affect turnout on Election Day? To answer that, we've asked our friend and data guru, Tom Bonier from Target Smart, to come on. We rely on data from their Target Early tool all the time, and I know campaigns around the country count on their modeling. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. What better time to have him on to look under the hood one more time before Election Day? Tom, welcome.
It's great to be here with y'all.
Alex, where should we get started, my friend?
Tom, really excited to have you on. There's a lot of, I think, separating the wheat from the chaff that's going on right now. And the overall theme of this show is going to be just asking campaign manager and a data guru where we really should be focusing. It feels like with, again, about a zillion tweets, and we've gotten so many questions about this. The only thing we can really say about early voting so far is that it's different. Is it fair to say that a lot of people don't have a clue as to how it's going to go one way? Like, where is it?
Yeah. when you talk about separating the wheat from the chaff when it comes to early vote analysis, there's not a lot of wheat there. I'm a huge believer in early vote analysis. There's actually a ton you can learn from it if you do it right. But that's a giant if. And it's funny at this point in the cycle because we're seeing sort of everyone jump in. You know, for years, I've been trying to convince people we should be paying attention to the early vote. And this year I'm telling people, oh, wait a second, you're not doing it. Like Elon Musk is out there now tweeting out his early vote analysis in Pennsylvania, which sort of cracks me up. So yeah, you can learn a lot from it. It's 60 million votes that have been cast, as you said. That's a lot of votes, but there's also just a ton of caveats, and we can dig into that. But like my top line big caveat is good early vote analysis depends on comparing it to context, generally the last election. And we're not looking at it and saying, well, look, this side is winning the early vote, therefore they're going to win. It doesn't work that way. The way it works is we're looking for signs of intensity or enthusiasm from certain groups of voters. And the way we generally discern that is by seeing which groups are overperforming or underperforming their past performance. But here's the caveat. We know what happened in 2020. It was a pandemic. There was a massive, heroic, by the way, shift by election officials to make it easy for people to vote safely during a deadly pandemic. But what that meant was 2/3 of all votes in 2020 were cast before Election Day. Huge increase compared to prior elections. 2 years later in 2022, that went down to 46% as we saw people gradually shifting back to their pre-pandemic voting behavior. We know that Donald Trump in 2020 told his supporters that vote by mail was fraudulent. So there was this mass evacuation of early vote among Republicans, what used to be a big advantage for them. And meanwhile, we know in this election, we anticipated going in that a lot of Democratic voters who had been Election Day voters all along, went to early voting for that one election, would go back to Election Day voting. So when we're analyzing the early vote, we really have to consider all of those different factors before we can draw any sort of conclusion.
What of those now, if we're looking at the Republicans have obviously tried to they've realized they shot themselves in the foot. They're trying to bring it back. But at the same time, then you've got, by all accounts, terrible field operation, which I know, Joe, you can speak to at this point. A lot of purposes of a well-run campaign is chasing and turning out votes. They're doing things like handing it off to PACs, still trying to overcome the whole it's fraudulent thing. So how does that factor in?
Well, and Joe, you should weigh in on this element, because I think one of the things that we know that we're trying to do generally as a campaign or a party entity with the early vote, number one, you want to bank votes early, right? You want to get people off the list so you can focus on a smaller universe of voters. But ideally, you're trying to bank the people who weren't going to vote anyhow. If you're spending a ton of resources trying to turn people out, who, if you just waited, we're going to vote on election day, you're probably wasting those resources. As people always tell you, an early vote counts the same as an election day vote. And so that's a mistake that I think Democrats have made in some cases. In 2020, we did a good job creating new voters out of the early vote. So that's what I've been looking at in the early vote now to see, are there signs that Republicans are doing the hard work in converting new voters, creating new voters? And the answer is no, they aren't. Pennsylvania is my favorite example of this because it's fairly clean from a data perspective. You know, early voting in Pennsylvania is basically mail voting. You can kind of vote early in person, but what that means is you go into the election office and apply for your mail ballot right there. They'll give it to you and then you can cast it. It's not as easy as early in person in other places. And we know Republicans were told not to vote by mail, as I said a minute ago, 4 years ago. So this is a test of like, how have they been able to pivot, and do they have the operational and organizational strength to create new votes? And when you look at the data, 48% of the registered Republicans who have already voted in Pennsylvania, so they're early voters, 48% of them were election day voters last time around. That's a plurality. 46% were mail voters last time. So these are the people who already were doing what they wanted to do. They're just doing it again. Then they took a whole bunch of regular voters who were going to vote on election day anyhow. They brought them in. So, you know, if you do the quick math on that, that leaves you about 6% of their voters are people who didn't vote in 2020. I will tell you, that's a historically very small share, just based on population growth and changes and that sort of thing. You would generally expect to see double digits of new voters coming into the process. Republicans lost the popular vote, let's remember, by what? Nationally, about 7 million votes last time around. So it's on them to change the electorate, to bring a lot. We've heard that they're going to, he's going to go on Joe Rogan. He's going to get all these young men out to vote. And look, that still could happen. But what it means is Republicans are still in the same position that they were in 4 years ago. They're going to rely on heavy new voter turnout on election day to pull this out. And, Joe, I defer to you on this, but that's a pretty tough hill to climb.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear. Well, can you go over where the Democrat side is in Pennsylvania? I mean, it's just to compare apples and apples in terms of...
Yeah, great point. So among Democrats who have voted already, 14% were election day voters. So 48% to 14%. So Democrats are not just kind of pulling people who would have voted on election day. They're frankly allowing the people who voted by mail last time and liked it to do it. But you can tell from the data, look, Democrats aren't doing a huge early vote push in Pennsylvania or elsewhere, but they have this base of numbers that they've gotten in previous years, especially 2020, where those people are coming up. But yeah, that ratio of 48% of Republicans to only 14% of Dems, to me, if I'm a Republican, I look at that and I say, that's not great.
And you put on top of that, and that's where I can come in here, you put on top of that so that literally half of the Republicans that are voting voted on election day last time, close to it. Very few of the Democrats that are voting early voted on election day last time. So the question is, if someone's cannibalizing their election day vote, it's likely to be the Republican Party at this time. The problem with that for them is twofold, because it gets down to who can turn out their vote, more of their vote on election day. And because the organization that Harris has been built over a couple of years to be prepared for this moment. And they have an organization that is now literally taking these people who vote early off of their targets, which is, a plan they've had in place for some time, so that on election day, they're only focused on people that have not voted yet and on voters that they have targeted to get out. And they have an organization that was built to do that. The Republicans, their organizational structure's in a shambles because of what happened when Trump had his daughter-in-law take over the RNC, and they dismantled the get out the vote effort there. So you first start off with possibly cannibalizing their election day vote. This is something we always wonder about with early voting. The Democrats clearly weren't pushing people to vote early, but are keeping track of it and knocking them off the list. So lets them put a much stronger organization with a lot more money and a lot more volunteers. And you look at the energy that happened when Harris got into the race and the hundreds of thousands of new volunteers that moved into the existing organization that had already been being built for Election Day. It just speaks to, I think, a pretty big advantage. But Tom, we say this all the time, and I've heard you say it. At this point, I'd much rather be the Harris campaign than the Trump campaign.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, from everything you said there, which I very much agree with, there's another element for potential optimism among the Harris campaign and Democrats when you look at that Pennsylvania data, but frankly, the early vote elsewhere, that would suggest that even to the extent that we are seeing Republicans occupying or accounting for a larger share of the early vote, that's overinflating the potential benefit to them. And that one thing we know from 2020, because in the weeds here a little bit, but we know that most states, when they report vote totals, they'll break it out by how people voted. They'll break out the candidate numbers by Election Day vote and early vote. We know that Republicans who voted early 4 years ago were much more likely to vote for President Biden than Republicans who voted on Election Day. It makes sense, right? Because those are people who were defying the leader's edict that early voting was fraudulent. And so when we look at those numbers in Pennsylvania, we know that a lot of those Republicans who are voting, the 46% who have voted already, who voted on early last time around 4 years ago, well, that's a more Democratic universe than it would suggest. There's a lot of crossover voters. We looked at that Pennsylvania audience and we found that fully a third of those registered Republicans who voted early in the presidential primary. We also know that early Republican primary voters were way more likely to vote for Nikki Haley. And we're seeing this reflected in the polls a little bit. And with any poll, we have to have the caveat, take it with a grain of salt. But we've seen consistently in the public polls that have broken out their polling results with a crosstab on people who have voted already. Vice President Harris is leading by really commanding margins, surprising margins. It's why I'm taking it with a grain of salt. Yeah, huge. It's huge. And you look at our model of partisanship, because we know this universe, we know who voted. And realistically, that type of polling, by the way, should be the most accurate polling out there, because we know that likely voter polling suffers because the pollster has to guess at who's going to vote. Well, when you're doing a poll of who has voted, we know who's voted. It's a known audience. You can weight it perfectly to that audience. So there's not really an excuse for them to be missampling that.
Yeah, it's like 62-33 or something. I mean, it's like...
Yeah, and this is what's fascinating, because one of the people, obviously, that they sort of outsourced their get out the vote effort to, Elon Musk, has been out there, and he looked at the early vote data in Pennsylvania and declared it's crushing victory is coming for Trump in Pennsylvania. And I think I responded to that by saying, it doesn't take, it just shows that a rocket scientist who, and he's not one, but has no clue how to look at this data if that's what he thinks it says. It's just crazy.
My knock on that was it was the Cybertruck of early vote analysis. It's laughable. But, the interesting thing is, and again, this is Pennsylvania, but we can look at the same patterns that we're talking about in Pennsylvania are emerging everywhere. Just Pennsylvania is a great example of it, because we have partisan registration and the mail voting and all that. But we also know that Republicans have been bragging for the last 4 years, but especially for the last few months, that they've really invested in voter registration. Like I said before, that they're going to get out this new sort of low propensity group of voters, mostly young men. They've been bragging especially about registration numbers in Pennsylvania, North Carolina. And when we look at the early vote data and we look at the people who have voted already and weren't registered to vote in 2020. So these are only the people in the battlegrounds who are new registrants since the last presidential. There's almost 1 million of those voters just in the battleground so far. So it's not nothing, a pretty sizable universe. The Democratic advantage among those voters, just in terms of partisanship, is double the Democratic advantage among the entire early vote universe. So it's a much more Democratic universe at this point. The early vote can help us test the theories of the case for each campaign. And this has been, it's not what we're saying. It's what the Trump campaign is saying, how they're going to win. And all we can do at this point is give them an incomplete grade. I'm not giving them a failing grade on that claim yet, but we're saying, well, look, it's not showing up in the early vote. You're going to have to do it on Election Day.
They have to do it on Election Day. And part of that problem is, do they even know? I mean, this is the part of the thing. If they don't have an organization that can track who's voted already and then only concentrate on those who haven't. The reason I laughed when they offloaded stuff to Musk about a month ago, I think is when it came out that's where they place a lot of their cards, is you cannot build it's not possible. You cannot build. I don't care if you're the best organization out there. You just can't do it in 30 days. You cannot assemble that thing fast enough, put everything together and implement it with any kind of true ability to get out the vote. By the way, I've been there. I've been in campaigns where things closed late and you had a big lead and you thought, and the campaign had not put enough into the field organization and to get out the vote. And suddenly there's this panic. Oh my gosh, we're in a dead heat. You got to do something. And I've been there trying. It's like plugging holes in a die. And as stuff is flooding out, you cannot do it. And so I think this is a real problem for them on election day.
It's funny because I think people have complained perhaps that, well, it's surprising that the legal decisions against Donald Trump haven't hurt him as much. But this is like a very grounded and functional way that the legal decisions against him have hurt him for everything that you mentioned, because, as you said, it's caused him to bankrupt the RNC, to put resources into his legal defense and so on and so forth, when those resources generally would have been going to building and maintaining that ground operation. And Elon Musk, as we all know, Elon Musk is a fake it till you make it sort of guy, right? Except he often doesn't make it. That's his hallmark. He'll go out there and say, this thing is happening. I'm going to do this thing. We're going to release this thing on this date. And it never happens, right? And so we shouldn't be surprised that now he's sharing early vote analysis and voter registration analysis that is clearly not actually good for the campaign. I do think he might believe it is, because we've all been doing this for a very long time. You learn along the way. The idea that someone could come in and figure it out in a couple of months is just silly.
It's not going to happen. And technology is not going to fix it.
Well, their technology has been failing there. That's the funny thing, is even the technology, we hear that their apps are, you hear people who are on the ground in Pennsylvania and elsewhere complaining that the apps don't work, that they're crashing. And we've all been there. The difference is we've been there a year out before Election Day when you're fielding something new, not during GOTV.
Yeah, tell me about it. I'm doing that on Says Us right now. So it's kind of glitchy, but
I got on Says Us this morning. I encourage everyone to get there. I was playing around with it and I like it.
Okay, thanks, man. Yeah, so Alex, I thought you had a poll question that you wanted to ask.
Before we get too far away, he gave some numbers in Pennsylvania that I think a lot of our listeners are going to be excited to hear. Not just because they're rosy or not, but just because it gives better context. What about the other two in the blue wall, so to speak? Do you have those numbers in Wisconsin and Michigan?
Michigan and Wisconsin, they're a little bit more challenging from an analytic perspective, only because you don't have partisan registration there. So we use modeled partisanship. And if you go to our Target Early website, you'll see that I actually had my team include a sort of disclaimer that you have to check off to acknowledge, because a lot of times people will see the modeled partisanship and they'll think, oh, that's predicting Harris support. You have to think about just like you would party registration, where we know, look, it's highly correlated with candidate vote choice, but it's not perfect. So caveats aside, I feel very good about the early vote in Michigan and Wisconsin now. In fact, those are the two states that have surprised me the most, because when we went into this early voting period, like I said, I wrote something a month ago about this, because I said, look, I know this is what's going to happen. The vote's going to shift more Republican because of everything that we've talked about here, all the different vote mode switches and all that. It's going to appear more Republican, but they're going to be just converting election day vote. And what's curious is in Michigan and Wisconsin, that's not actually happening, seemingly. It's actually more Democratic than it was at this point in 2020. And there's not a great explanation for that other than the lack of Republican organization, or a lack of emphasis there, because there haven't been massive changes in the early voting there. And in fact, to the extent that there have been changes, they should have been more favorable to Republicans. In Michigan, they added early in person voting. And we know it's not bad for Democrats, but in terms of Republicans looking at early voting, they're more likely to do the early in person rather than mail voting, because of the sort of remnants of what Donald Trump told them. So what you're seeing in there is electorates that are actually, again, they appear to be more Democratic. A lot of that in Michigan is being fueled by big turnout in Detroit. especially among Black voters, especially among older Black women, just coming out in massive numbers. We saw some of this in new voter registration data over the last few months. We've seen this in special elections, so perhaps I shouldn't be surprised. But again, those numbers look really good at this point. We have to repeat the same caveat. Election day will be decisive. No one wins the election in the early vote. You don't have it wrapped up and say we can go home now. But I feel really good about what we're seeing in those two states.
Back to, I think, where Joe was going. So I think you keep mentioning the modeling and would love kind of a 30,000 foot explanation of it. But with respect to this, so, and I think you either quote tweeted this or pass this along. Lakshya Jain on Twitter pointed this out. Like Pennsylvania polling, you look at the Q poll, for example, who are a highly respected pollster, generally has been pretty accurate over the years. I mean, or less inaccurate than others. But their last polls have gone Harris 5, Harris +3, Trump +2. But then you look at how their samples are and the party ID in those samples, and it actually kind of mirrors that. So is it really a 7-point swing in polling, or is it are they basically changing who they like? I'm not asking you to defend the polling industry, but like how can they vary so much from release to release? And is it the modeling?
Yeah, I'm going to date myself here, but when I was a kid, some of my favorite books were these choose your own adventure books. It was like a gimmick where you'd read through a section and then you'd say, if you want to do this happen next, go to this page. If you want that to happen next, go to this page. And you'd sort of weave your way through the book. Well, polling this year especially has been a bit of a choose your own adventure, where the polling has been remarkably stable, by the way. I think we're overreacting to small movements because it's been so stable. So when a little thing happens in the polls, we all like freak out when we shouldn't be. Because we have to remember, generally the polling bounces around way more. The polling has been stable and has shown Vice President Harris with a narrow but stable lead throughout the battlegrounds and in enough states to get to 270 plus. But to the extent that we see movement, we do see movement within polls from time to time. We saw this with New York Times polls and their state level polls too, and it was the exact same thing. In fact, most of the polls where we're seeing these shifts and you're able to look under the hood as we are there, this is exactly what's happening. It's not that suddenly these swing voters who were with us are moving against us. It's that one poll was imagining an electorate where it was leaning Democratic in terms of the composition of the electorate. Because like I said before, the pollster has to make some educated estimate of who's going to vote. And then the next month they do another poll and suddenly their educated estimate of who's going to vote shifts to Republicans, where more Republicans are going to vote. And like, I guess there's some value in that, right? We should all be considering what, certainly when I'm working with campaigns and either we're doing the polling or we're working with the pollsters there, I'm always pushing to have multiple turnout scenarios in the polling because we have to consider the implications of different turnout scenarios. And then we have strategic discussions about how that changes what we do in the campaign, right? From the public perception, it's different. My biggest complaint about this is there isn't transparency. In fact, it's always reported as, like in the case of these Quinnipiac polls, that Pennsylvania has swung against the vice president. No, what it's really saying is, well, if Republicans turn out at a higher rate to this point where it's a R +3 or +4 electorate, this is what happens. Trump wins by a point or whatever that poll shows, 2 points. If it doesn't do that and it's a D+1, D+2 electorate, then Vice President Harris wins by 3 points or 4 points or 5 points, depending on what those polls show. But the last thing they should do is then provide the historical context to say, and by the way, this is what it was in 2020. And then you can draw your own conclusions. You can make the argument, if you want, that these states that post-Dobbs, where we've only seen Democratic overperformance and Republican underperformance in polls and in actual voter turnout, you can make the argument, but that actually this time around in this election, Republicans are going to have a historically high share of the electorate. And I'm not saying that's impossible. It could happen. But we should be looking at all of these through the lens of plausibility. That to me seems less plausible than something that at a minimum just replicates the 2020 baseline in terms of partisan distribution of turnout.
So what do you make of Nevada and what Ralston's saying? I just want to get your take on that one before we go down into any, or do you have an opinion?
Number one, I agree with the general popular take that if you're going to be looking at early vote in Nevada, you should pay attention to Ralston. Just he's been doing it longer than anyone else. He knows the state from that perspective better than anyone else. But he, just like me, just like anyone else who has been doing this for a long time, is also fallible. I know he's been a bit negative about what he's seen from Democrats in the early voting there. They'll give him credit. He's also offering the caveat that, like, he's telling people we don't have a good baseline here, which is, I think, in a way, almost where that conversation should end. I went back to his analysis from a few days before the election in 2022, and he was super negative about Democrats' chances in Nevada in 2022, just a few days out, based on the early vote. Like I said at the beginning, early voting analysis is difficult anywhere. It's probably harder in Nevada than anywhere else because you are having massive changes. There are so many different ways people can vote. It changes from election to election. If you look from election year to election year, some years Democrats come out earlier and then Republicans pour it on late. In other years, the opposite happens. And then you have the factor that they added automatic voter registration in Nevada over the last few years, and the default registration is unaffiliated. And so we know a lot of those people who generally would be registered Democrats, who vote overwhelmingly Democrat, are now registered as unaffiliated. In fact, over the past year, a majority of new registrants in Nevada are unaffiliated, which is way more than it's ever been because of this automatic voter registration thing. So when you look and compare to 4 years ago and say the Democratic share of early vote is down, some not insignificant part of that is just because a lot of them are hiding out in the unaffiliated category. And I'm not saying that accounts for all of what we're seeing. It's all of these factors at play. It is Republicans' vote mode shifting to earlier vote, that sort of thing. So, yeah, I mean, I think if any state Republicans are looking at and they feel better about the early vote, it's probably Nevada, but their confidence level on that should be very low.
Before we get to election, and I want to get there, one more kind of general question. This is from our friend and frequent listener, Amy Chapman. So I wanted to make sure we got to her question. I know we all do. She said, after 2016, pollsters really had a moment of reflection. But since then, it feels like pollsters have doubled down on the, nah, we're right all the time, even though polling has gotten less and less accurate in terms of head-to-head numbers. At what point does the love affair with all the polling wane? Before Tom kills this answer, Joe, what do you think?
Well, no, I've been saying this all year. We used to, in campaigns, when we had nightly tracking, at least all the campaigns I was in where we had nightly tracking, we called it the crack cocaine of politics because you became addicted to it every night. I mean, like literally at 3 a.m, you couldn't wake up to check into your nightly tracking. Even when you intellectually understood, you could wake up at 6 or 7 and still see the same numbers and everything. But you do. And I think that's what's happened. I think the media, the punditry has just become addicted to, it's like a fix every day, another poll, another poll, another poll. And they're shakier. They're obviously, with the shifting ways that you need to reach people to poll them and the reluctance to answer, it's becoming tougher and tougher, but we're still addicted to it because it's basically the two things that everybody became addicted to is how much money has anybody raised and what's the latest poll say. It works with donors and it creates a large amount of anxiety, particularly if Quinnipiac suddenly comes out with a poll showing a shift to Trump in Pennsylvania.
We had a client who I will not name, but for years would have us do trackers where the last one would be in the field the night before election day. So we literally be looking at the results like afternoon of election day, where there's literally nothing you're going to do with that poll, but they just wanted to have that data, to your point, that addiction. And I think, Alex, to your point, like mentioning 2016, there was this introspection. We need to change. We need to adapt. We need to evolve. And they did make changes, right? But the problem is they're always adapting to the last election and a lot of times overcorrecting. And there's not a lot of looking at in the moment and finding means to improving and updating what we're doing in cycle. So we're always correcting. And the funny thing to me is in 2022, as we all saw, like the polls weren't good in 2022. They just weren't. But somehow there's been this like whitewashing of that history where 538 published a piece after the election a couple months after where the headline was actually the polls were historically accurate in 2022. And then they went out and made the case and they said, look, well, the average poll only missed by 4.9 points. in 2022. And I'm thinking, well, that's not good. The average poll missed by 4 points. That means we had a lot that missed by 6, 7, 8, 9 points. And yes, you had some that missed by less. But if the average missed by that much, that's not super helpful. I could tell you those numbers without the poll.
Right. But the other thing, Tom, I think that's going on, we saw this in 2022. A bunch of them were like out there, red wave poll. And then their very last poll, so they had 7 or 8 of those in a row. And then their very last one showed a much tighter race. And so they both got to set up the red wave that turned into the red mirage, and also to be able to post the election, look back, go, what are you talking about? I had it only... I was only 1 point off.
That's right. Well, we're seeing some of that now. I mean, they've kept it fairly close, but like it is absurd. Let's just say it is statistically impossible what we are seeing. It's not just improbable to see poll after poll after poll in all these states that show tied or a 1 point race. If the race actually is tied or a 1 point race, which it could be in any of these states, just basic statistical distribution, you should have polls that are 2 points and 3 points, and that's how it works. So that the fact that they're all coming in at this point where they're tied or 1 point is suggesting that there is something happening with the pollsters where they're being very cautious. And now the models, right? All of the predictive models are now gravitating back to 50-50, where literally they cannot be wrong, because they're also reminding us at the same time that, by the way, 50-50 doesn't mean that the outcome is going to be close, that if actually one of those candidates wins by a wider margin, that is also predicted in the model. So they have literally covered every single base, at which point we have to ask ourselves, what value are we driving from this entire act that so many people are obsessed with?
And one thing that we keep coming back to, that I keep saying, and I'm pretty sure this isn't clinging to like a raft of opium here, but these campaigns are not running their campaigns like it is 50-50 in a lot of places. You are not like Trump screaming fraud in Pennsylvania is not the act of a campaign that thinks they're in a good position. I mean, like, you start connecting those dots.
Yeah, you certainly wouldn't want to undermine the veracity of the result in advance of an election that you're expecting to win.
So let's move to election night. And it's a question for both of you. Where should our listeners be looking, not just in terms of bellwether precincts or anything, but how should they be looking at data? Where should they be figuring out, getting a pulse of where things are going really between now and then on election night? Yeah,
well, I think, a lot of people have put out some stuff that I think is interesting, that's sort of out there in terms of like, watch this county, watch that county. I think I'll make it a little bit simpler than that in some ways. First of all, there'll be some states that'll be earlier, where they're counting faster. Or we can look at the flip side of that coin, where I don't expect to see earlier results, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, because they can't count the mail ballots early. Pennsylvania has made some changes where they can count them faster, but, Michigan has allowed them to start counting ballots as of a handful of days ago, so they will have faster results. I think that'll be an interesting one. I think North Carolina and Georgia will be faster, and I think those are fascinating. Obviously, Vice President Harris wins either of those, or the results are looking good in those. That is a very, very good sign. And then the other thing I look at is, again, on our Target Early site, we are showing you the partisan distribution of the early vote basically in real time. It's updated twice a day of who's voted. We're going to go into election day where that'll be in there on the site. Most of these states, especially the states where they counted the mail votes early, they will report those separately. Polls close, and then as soon as they're legally allowed to, they will dump out a bunch of votes, and that will be the early vote in those counties. And you can compare how the candidates are performing among the early vote versus what the actual partisan distribution is. That's what I'm going to be looking at, because if Vice President Harris is outperforming the partisan distribution of the early vote, it means she's getting big crossover vote. And that is a very, very good sign. So that's the first thing that I'll be looking for on election night.
I'd say that one of the things people can do is just look at a rural county anywhere that's being reported, and a suburban county and an urban county, and compare 2020 to what's coming in. In other words, like Pennsylvania may be late, but there will be some rural counties in New York and other places that are reporting. And what's that mix? I mean, is she outperforming Biden? Is Trump outperforming where he was in 2020? And I think you'll start to get a sense of how, if she's outperforming Biden or doing better in those kinds of precincts, for just one example, you could start to understand what's happening. Because some counties like Mecklenburg County in North Carolina, I think keeping an eye on that all night may be really important to understand what's happening, whether North Carolina's in play or not, which I think it is, but we'll see.
Let's close out with a couple good listener questions. The first is just basically everyone's been asking us what states we're most least confident in. Tom, would love you to look at, we're not going to do all 50, although that would be extremely funny. Just talking about the 7 battleground states, so to speak. Where are you most confident? Can you rank them? Don't do all 7 in order, but where are you feeling good? Where do Democrats need to close the gap a little bit?
I mean, so I'll base this on just the data that I've been seeing between voter registration and early vote, and then sort of mashing that in with the polling. I mean, and let's start with the caveat that all of them are in play for either candidate, not to make this a cop-out, but no one is sealed the deal, perhaps, in any of these states. But like I said before, the blue wall looks strong, especially Michigan and Wisconsin for Vice President Harris. Good early vote numbers, good registration numbers, good organizations. If we're just factoring in who can do the work on election day, again, Pennsylvania, the only reason I'm not including Pennsylvania with those 3 in terms of the looking very strong is because the caveat that, it's just mail voting there. So we don't have a great sign of Republican strength, but I feel good about Pennsylvania. And then beyond that, when we look at the 4 Sunbelt states, Georgia and North Carolina started slow for Democrats in the early vote and has been coming back very strong to the point where we're actually ahead of 2020 now in Georgia. So, Georgia was one that the polling looked tough for us back prior to July. It's gotten better. I feel good about those, but I would put those 2 in a group right behind. Arizona and Nevada, the early vote doesn't look as good as I said, but it also doesn't look bad. Frankly, it's just more of a question mark. So I just have less certainty there. But again, knowing what the Senate races there in Arizona, Ruben Gallego just running such a strong campaign, I think that makes it harder for Trump. That would be my rough ranking. But honestly, if you view those together, it would look like they're all almost on the same line with very slight differences there. I mean, it's very hard to discern differences. There are strong signs for Vice President Harris in all of those states.
Yeah, it's not impossible that she could carry all of them. It's also not impossible that 3 or 4 could go the other way. I mean, it's just the way it is.
All right, this is from Scott in Arizona. I just picked this. A lot of people asked, but Scott, you're the one. I'd like to hear everyone on the show's bold predictions for the election. Now, Scott did not know Tom would be on the show today, so Tom gets a bonus bold prediction.
It's funny. I did a British radio interview the other day, and they asked me a similar question, and I said, well, I don't make predictions, and he said there was some quote from some famous English footballer who I wouldn't know, where he said, I don't make predictions and I never will. And I said, I'm going to have to steal that at some point over the next few days, but I'll make a not so bold prediction. I do think, look, in every election, we have surprises. There are always surprises. It's like, we had some in the House in 2022, districts that just weren't on the radar that ended up being very close or actually flipped. We haven't been paying a lot of attention to the House, I think, nationally, but there are very good things for Democrats. I think you'll see some positive surprises for Democrats in the House. Any Democrat who around late October is talking about potential surprises will always want to talk about Texas and Florida. I'll be looking at that Texas Senate race once polls close to see if there's maybe a surprise there. I'm not going to predict anything, but again, that's another one to watch. In general, I actually do anticipate that we'll have more surprises in this election than we generally do, just because of how close things are and sort of the dynamic nature. And maybe the thing that isn't priced into all of the analysis and the polling right now, which is this Dobbs surge, that could produce some really interesting results.
You did quote the great Paul Gascoigne, now Tottenham legend, for what it's worth.
Don't know who that is.
That's the British soccer player you talked about. I think what I've been saying privately is either everything I know is wrong or Harris is going to win. And that's not necessarily bold either, but to me, everything that has been pointing in one direction for so long and nothing has substantively shifted it. I think looking at Michigan in particular, and we have a lot of friends crunching a lot of data there, Michigan might be the one where you might see a 4 or 5 point Harris win if things keep breaking this way. That might be a little wide, but Michigan, I think I'll go with Michigan is not going to be as close as people think. Just going with my home state there.
I've been saying for eons that the structure of the race is 46-53, 46 for Trump, 53 who've decided they're not going to be for him, never were going to be for him. The question was, do they stay home? Do they vote third party? Do they vote for Harris? And I think that's where the race is moving. I think people are moving towards her. And I think my own view is that we still got to do the work these last 4 or 5 days here, but Harris wins. The House goes to Democrats because of all that movement. Whereas 3 or 4 months ago, I would have said there's no way, no chance that we could hold the Senate, given the map and the races out there. I now think this would be my bold prediction, although it's not, because I'm going to caveat it by saying there's a small but very real chance that Democrats will hold the U.S. Senate. And whether that's, I think Tester could be a surprise. I know people have counted him out, but I think they're making a mistake. I think Tester can win in Montana. And I'm with Tom about Texas and Florida. They always look enticing. We always think maybe this time. But, this time, just maybe, Cruz, I wouldn't count Rick Scott in the reelection either. I mean, I think there's some real possibilities out there for Democrats to hold the Senate. And my prediction would be that we will, with all those caveats that I paid. But I think that the way things are moving, and I agree with I think what Tom was alluding to, that we've overperformed since Dobbs on the Democratic side. I think that's going to happen, and I think where that if that does happen, we were surprised. But a lot of people were surprised that the red wave turned into a red mirage. If that's happening again, in the sense that we're going to outperform what the polls are saying and the way people are maybe misreading the early vote, there's a real chance that we can all be surprised Tuesday night or several days after, because that's what it'll take, with the outcome and how well Democrats do.
All right. That's a really good place for us to end today. Unless, Tom, is there anything else you want to impart upon our listeners with 4 days to go?
I think we said it all. I'd love this conversation. I appreciate the opportunity.
Cool. Where can people find you, Tom?
Well, I hate to say it, but probably at X is still the best place, but says.us says us. I'm on there as of this morning. As I said before, you can find me there, and I'll be cross-posting everything across. So I would love to be done with Elon Musk and X after this election. You can go to targetsmart.com, where a lot of the analysis I mentioned in terms of the Target Early website, our voter registration dashboard, it's all available there.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for coming on, and thanks for plugging Says Us. Everybody, if you haven't tried it out yet, please go over and sign up and post. We're trying to build an alternative to X over there that supports the kind of conversation that democracy demands, and instead of tearing down community. But thanks for listening to That Trippi Show. Most importantly, go vote. Go to vote.org to make sure your registration is up to date, particularly if you live in Virginia or some other states that have been messing around with that. Find out where you can early vote and make a plan to vote. The podcast will always be free and part of Resolute Square, so check out the latest at resolutesquare.com/Trippi. One programming note, it sounds like Truth Social has been trolling some of our listeners with ads. We've heard from some of you that Spotify has been running ads for that platform without our knowledge. We flagged it for Spotify and would appreciate it if you could make your voices heard. Click Contact Us in the support section on Spotify and send them a message. Please subscribe to That Trippi Show and leave a review on Apple or wherever you listen. Also, if you're listening to this episode on YouTube, please like and subscribe to get alerts when we post the next episode. Tom is very happy that we only do the audio on YouTube and don't use the video, as am I and Alex. But we might change that. You can always send us a question to thattrippishow@gmail.com or leave us a question and review on iTunes. See you next week. Thanks, everybody. Keep up the work.
Resolute Square.